Carl Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But what if you don't yet know who that is? In a world that rewards certainty and punishes doubt, we often confuse ego for identity, performance for presence. This isn't just philosophy, it's your everyday struggle, quietly whispering behind your achievements and curated selfies. What happens when your inner compass no longer points to what's expected? This conversation isn't about destroying your ego. It's about seeing beyond it. Because somewhere beneath the noise, there's a deeper self waiting to be heard. Have you ever get that weird, low-key existential buzz when you're alone in your room? Maybe after scrolling through too many highlight reels on social media, and you suddenly wonder, wait, who even am I when nobody's watching? That moment, when the noise settles and you're left staring at yourself, not in the mirror, but somewhere deeper, that's where this whole thing about the ego starts to whisper. Not shout, whisper. Because the ego isn't loud. It's structured, confident, and composed. It's that part of you that thinks it knows who you are. The curated playlist of your personality. The name tag you wear to parties. The version of yourself you bring to the job interview. It's how we steer through daily life, making decisions, reacting to people, trying to be someone. In short, it's your conscious self, or at least the part you recognize. But here's the twist. The ego isn't the whole story. Not even close. It's like thinking the surface of the ocean is all there is, when underneath, 1,000 unseen currents move things in ways you can't always explain. One thinker, Carl Jung, once suggested that the ego is just the center of consciousness, not the center of who we are. The self, he believed, was far greater, stretching into the vast and mysterious territory of the unconscious. And if that sounds a little mystical, stick with me. It's actually more familiar than you think. Take this, for example. My friend Riley, 24, just got a promotion and hated it. Sounds bizarre, right? She had spent months hoping for that title, but when it came, she felt fake, like she was playing someone else. Turns out, she'd built her whole sense of self, her ego, around what her parents and college mentors told her success should look like. But her inner compass, the part of her that isn't so easily labeled, wanted something more creative, maybe even risky. Riley's ego wasn't lying to her. It just didn't know the whole story. That's the thing. The ego builds from what it's experienced, what it's absorbed. Childhood scripts, social roles, the shoulds we carry around like duty. And while it's necessary, we'd be lost without it. It often forgets that it's just a piece of the puzzle, not the whole damn thing. Another example? Malik. He's 20, a sophomore in college, totally drowning in the pressure to be seen. He's constantly curating his online identity, terrified that if he doesn't post often enough or doesn't show enough ambition, he'll just disappear. What's wild is the more effort he puts into constructing that version of himself, the more hollow he feels. That's ego fatigue, because his entire sense of worth is getting funneled into what other people see rather than what he actually feels when he's alone. That quiet discomfort, that's his deeper self knocking. The part that doesn't care how polished his feed looks, but deeply cares whether he's being real with himself. What no one really prepares you for is this. The ego, strong and articulate as it may be, is a limited narrator. It's the tour guide, not the landscape. And sometimes, we let it speak over the rustle of the forest within us. We think we're chasing dreams when really, we're just repeating patterns or avoiding fears. I remember having a long talk with my buddy Jonah. He's 27, and he just moved back home after a failed startup. He was beating himself up, saying he'd lost himself. But the truth was, the self he thought he had wasn't real to begin with. It was stitched together from TED Talks, hustle culture, and a fear of being average. That version cracked under pressure, and thank God it did. Because only when that ego image failed was Jonah able to ask, what do I actually want when nobody's watching? What feels right even if it doesn't look impressive? That moment of not knowing, of feeling lost. That's not a breakdown. That's the beginning of a different kind of truth. But I get it. It's scary. Because the ego loves certainty, labels, definitions. It craves boundaries. I am this. I am not that. It wants control. And society feeds that addiction. From resumes to dating profiles, we're constantly nudged to build a solid identity, one that's sellable, consistent, and, God forbid, never confusing. But here's the secret. Nobody prints on a coffee mug. A fixed ego is a fragile ego. Growth requires contradiction. Real self-understanding often begins where certainty ends. Now, don't get me wrong. The ego isn't the villain. It's just not the king. It's a survival mechanism that helps you function in the world. But if you let it become your whole compass, you'll always be steering around the same predictable loops. You'll keep bumping into the same types of toxic friendships, the same fears, the same unsatisfying highs, because your ego is only using what it already knows. There was a time when Carl Jung pointed out that the ego is just the tip of a much deeper self, and that many of our struggles come from mistaking the surface for the soul. Sometimes we mistake familiarity for destiny. Now let me tell you about Jamie. They're 29, non-binary, and navigating a career in a super-traditional corporate firm. Everyone around them uses rigid identity language, titles, roles, decorum. For a while, Jamie played along, kept their true feelings about gender, expression, and purpose bottled up. But the pressure kept mounting. Panic attacks, unexplained rage, numbness. All of it was their deeper psyche pushing back against a costume they'd outgrown. Jamie's ego had become a shield, and now that shield was suffocating them. Only when they let themselves fall apart, really fall apart, did they begin to build something new, something real. It wasn't polished. It wasn't always brave, but it was alive. And that aliveness? It only shows up when the ego steps back and listens. What we often forget is that being human isn't about having a consistent identity. It's about being able to hear all the voices inside you, your doubts, your fears, your longings, and making space for them. The ego wants simplicity, but your inner world is a symphony. Not every instrument plays at the same time, and some of them are out of tune. But they still belong. So where does that leave us? In a world obsessed with certainty and identity, maybe the bravest thing you can do is admit you don't fully know yourself yet, that there are corners of you unexplored, parts that don't fit your current brand, feelings that contradict your plans. The ego will try to edit that out. But your soul leans in. And if we're being honest, deeply, gut-level honest, most of us are walking around carrying egos that were built to protect us, not express us. Built from old fears, childhood wounds, cultural templates, and while they helped us survive, they aren't enough to help us thrive. What we need isn't more ego. It's more integration, a slow, sometimes painful process of welcoming in the unfamiliar, the shadowy, the inconvenient truths. That means sitting with discomfort. It means not having all the answers. And yeah, it might mean letting go of a version of yourself that once felt safe. But let me tell you, The person you become after that, after the ego has been humbled, not crushed, is someone so much more vibrant, not flawless, not always confident, but whole, capable of connecting with others, not from a place of proving, but from a place of simply being. You know what's kind of ironic? The more we try to be ourselves, the more we often end up just reinforcing our ego. Like when people say, "That's just who I am," as if change or contradiction would somehow be a betrayal. But growth isn't betrayal. It's evolution. The self isn't fixed. It breathes. It breaks. It rearranges. I used to believe the ego was like a solid core, unchanging, dependable. But more and more, I'm starting to think it's more like a map drawn in pencil. Useful, sure, but not the territory, and certainly not permanent. When you realize that, you stop treating your mistakes like character flaws and start seeing them as updates. You stop holding on so tightly to being right, and instead, get curious about what's true. Think about how many people you know who are stuck. They're not lacking talent or drive. They're just attached to an outdated version of themselves. Maybe that version was born in a household where being sensitive wasn't safe, or in a school where success meant competition, not collaboration. The ego forms from those early blueprints, but life keeps changing the terrain. If we never revise the map, we get lost and blame ourselves for it. There's this old school belief that if your ego is strong, you're confident. But let's be real. Some of the most confident-seeming people are just the most offended. You ever meet someone who's always on, always fine, always performing some version of together? That's not strength, that's armor. And armor can't feel. Which brings me to the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the best thing that can happen to us is a crack, a failure, a breakup, a burnout. Something that pulls the rug out from under the ego's neatly arranged identity and forces us to look beneath. Not out of some spiritual cliché, but because we don't look there otherwise. We just don't. And it's not our fault. Modern life doesn't exactly encourage introspection. We're rewarded for polish, for hustle, for certainty. We're not exactly handed a manual on how to deal with our own chaos. In fact, when we start to unravel, people get uncomfortable. They throw us advice like, just move on or stay positive. But there's a kind of healing that doesn't respond to optimism. It responds to honesty, to silence, to depth. And this whole conversation around ego, that's the invitation. To pause, to ask, what part of me have I been editing out? Not for drama, not for performance, but because your wholeness depends on it. Sometimes I think about my younger self, 18, and terrified of not being interesting enough. I built an ego out of sarcasm and overachievement. I wore it like a second skin. But underneath, I was lonely. Not because people didn't like me, but because they didn't know me. I didn't even know me. I had confused my personality with my presence. And those are not the same thing. Presence happens when you're not trying so hard. When your ego softens enough to let something more spacious come through. Not the curated you, but the honest one. The one that still gets scared, still stumbles, still wonders, am I allowed to be this much? Yes. Yes, you are. One of the most comforting truths I've learned, albeit the hard way, is that you're not supposed to have it all figured out. The ego will try to rush you, convince you that you need answers, clarity, closure. But life doesn't unfold in straight lines. It loops, it backtracks, it throws curveballs. And sometimes, not knowing is the most fertile space you can live in, especially if you're young right now, in your 20s or early 30s, swimming through identity crises, career confusion, relational breakdowns. Let me just say this. You're not broken. You're becoming. You're shedding identities that never fully fit. That's not failure. That's progress. Messy, non-linear, uncomfortable progress. Take Kelly. She's 25, finishing grad school, everyone expecting her to go into law. She's good at it, sharp mind, top of her class. But she's having panic attacks in the shower. Hasn't told anyone. Why? Because her ego is wrapped around being the achiever, the reliable one. Admitting that she might want to pivot to something creative, maybe non-profit work, feels like betrayal. But it's not betrayal. It's clarity breaking through the noise. That internal conflict, it's not a flaw, it's a signpost. So many of us are living inside identities that were inherited, not chosen. That's not a moral failure. That's just the nature of the ego. It collects, it absorbs. But if you don't stop and ask, is this really mine? You'll live out someone else's life. That question, is this really mine, might be the most important one you ask yourself in your 20s. And I get it. Introspection can be exhausting. When you've got rent due, friends moving away, a job that's demanding and underpaying, who has time to sit around and get in touch with their inner world? But here's the trick. Your inner world is running the show whether you acknowledge it or not. It's the reason you overreact to criticism, or why you ghost people when things get too vulnerable, or why you stay in jobs that drain you. The ego is like the part of the iceberg you can see, but the mass of who you are, what you actually carry, is underneath. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes it louder, in sneakier ways. And I want to be really clear here. This isn't about demonizing the ego. It's about decentering it. Letting it take a step back so that other parts of you can come to the table. The parts that are scared. The parts that still believe in magic. The parts that carry grief or longing or softness. The ego wants to manage those parts, clean them up, tuck them away. But you need them. They're not dead weight. They're your roots. One of the wisest things I've ever read was the idea that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from integration. A view that someone like Carl Jung spent his entire life exploring. He didn't believe in slaying the ego, but in expanding the self wide enough to hold contradictions. I think what we're really hungry for, beneath the surface, is not more confidence or status or validation. We're hungry to feel whole, to stop living split between the me I show and the me I hide. And wholeness doesn't come from perfecting the ego. It comes from embracing the parts of yourself that don't fit neatly into any category. You don't need to be one thing. You just need to be here. Fully, honestly, willing to change your mind, willing to admit when something no longer fits. That's not weakness, that's maturity. And yeah, the world won't always reward that. It might label you flaky, or confusing, or inconsistent. But don't confuse inconsistency with incoherence. You can be a masterpiece and a work in progress at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's humanity. So here we are, you and me, somewhere in this weird, beautiful mess of becoming. And I think the question that lingers beneath all of this isn't just, who am I? But can I still love myself even when I don't know? That's where ego gets nervous, because it wants answers, identity, ground beneath its feet. It wants to be lovable because of achievements, clarity, success. But the deeper self asks something quieter. What if I'm lovable not because of anything I do, but because I exist? Messy, unsure, evolving. That's a radical thing to believe in a world that constantly tells you to market yourself. We were never really taught how to hold complexity. Everything is binaries: success or failure, happy or sad, right or wrong. And so, we build egos that reflect that duality, neatly compartmentalized, easily understood. But real life, it's full of gray, of contradictions, of days when you're full of joy and grief all at once, of identities that shift depending on who you're with, what stage you're in, or what season of healing you're going through. And the more you try to jam all of that into a tidy ego, the more pressure you feel to shrink yourself, to choose one version of you and kill off the rest. But what if that tension you feel isn't a problem to be fixed, but a truth to be listened to? Let me bring in one last example. Aiden. He's 32, newly single after ending a long-term relationship that looked perfect on the outside. They had a condo together, a dog, mutual friends. From the outside, it was goals, but on the inside, Aiden felt invisible. Not because his partner didn't love him, but because he had stopped showing up as himself. Somewhere along the way, his ego had made a trade. Stability for authenticity. It took him almost 2 years to admit it. When we talked, he told me something that stuck. I wasn't unhappy. I just wasn't me anymore. That hit hard, because how many of us are living like that? Numb, functional, but detached from the spark of who we really are. And how often do we confuse that detachment for maturity or sacrifice or being realistic? Sometimes we tell ourselves we've grown up, when really, we've just gotten really good at ignoring ourselves. That's what happens when ego leads the way without reflection. It builds a life that looks good on paper, but feels hollow in the heart. Now, I'm not saying we should throw out the ego entirely. That's not even possible. We need it. It helps us function, protect boundaries, communicate, navigate society. But it's like a loyal assistant that shouldn't be promoted to CEO. When we let it run the whole show, we end up living small, scared lives disguised as responsible ones. What if instead we practiced humility? Not the self-deprecating kind, but the kind that says, I don't know everything about myself yet, and that's okay. What if we let uncertainty become a sacred space instead of something to escape? Because let me tell you, some of the most beautiful, meaningful transformations I've seen in people didn't come from having it all figured out. They came from the courage to let go of what was no longer true. From the decision to listen to that quiet voice underneath the noise, the one that says, this isn't it. There's more to you. Keep going. That's not self-indulgence. That's self-respect. And maybe that's what we're all being invited into. Not a shinier ego, not a perfected identity, but a deeper relationship with the mystery of who we are becoming. One that makes space for uncertainty, for emotion, for stillness. Because when the ego isn't driving, we can finally hear the deeper rhythms. We start noticing what really energizes us, what relationships actually nourish us, what kind of life feels aligned, not just impressive. And we stop measuring our worth by output or approval and start rooting it in being, in presence. And yeah, that kind of clarity takes time. It's not a quick fix. It's not a morning routine. It's a slow, spiraling, often uncomfortable process of becoming real. But it's worth it. Because at the end of the day, I don't think any of us are really chasing success or perfection. I think we're all just trying to come home to ourselves. So if you're feeling lost, unsure, caught in the friction between who you've been and who you're becoming, take a breath. You're not broken. You're just shedding. And beneath all the noise, beneath the ego and the stories and the shoulds, there is a self in you that already knows. Not in a logical, strategic way, but in the quiet certainty of presence. in the way your chest softens when something feels right, in the way time disappears when you're with the right people, in the way your spirit whispers, "This is me," when you stop performing and just show up. Trust that, even when it doesn't make sense, especially when it doesn't make sense, because that's where the real story begins. Not with who you think you are, but with who you're still becoming. And that story, that's the one worth living. Here's what Jung understood that many of us forget. The ego is a tool, not your truth. If you're tired of pretending, tired of perfection, then maybe this is your turning point. The deeper self doesn't need applause, it just needs room. So here's your permission to not have it all together, to outgrow the roles, the expectations, the masks. Let the ego soften, let presence in. Because the real you, the whole you, you've only just begun to meet them.